The golden ballroom of Buckingham Palace sparkled under thousands of crystal chandeliers. Tonight was different from any other royal gathering. The atmosphere carried an electric tension that made even the most seasoned courtiers whisper nervously among themselves. Charles stood at the far end of the grand hall, his hands clasped behind his back as he surveyed the crowd of dignitaries, family members, and close friends. The occasion was meant to be a celebration of his recent charitable achievements, but everyone in the room knew there was more beneath the surface. The past months had been filled with speculation, rumors, and carefully worded statements from the palace press office. Tonight, many believed, would finally bring clarity to the questions that had been haunting the royal family for weeks. Camilla moved gracefully through the crowd, her emerald green gown catching the light as she spoke with various guests. She had perfected the art of royal conversation over the years, knowing exactly how long to spend with each person and what topics were safe to discuss. Yet tonight, there was something different in her demeanor. Those who knew her well could see the slight tension in her shoulders, the way her smile didn't quite reach her eyes. Kate entered the ballroom fashionably late, as was often expected of her. Her navy blue dress was elegant but understated, and her hair was pulled back in a simple yet sophisticated style. The murmur of conversation seemed to quiet slightly as she made her entrance. Though she appeared not to notice, she moved with the confidence that came from years of public life. But those closest to her could detect the subtle signs of nervousness. The relationship between the three had always been complex, though the public rarely saw beyond the carefully orchestrated appearances. Charles had known Camilla for decades, their history stretching back to their youth. Their relationship had weathered storms, separations, and public scrutiny before finding its way to acceptance and eventually marriage. It seemed like a settled chapter in his life. Kate's arrival in the family had brought fresh energy and a new generation of royal enthusiasm. Her marriage to William had been celebrated worldwide, and she had embraced her role with grace and dedication. Over time, she had developed her own relationship with Charles, one that grew from mutual respect into something deeper and more complex. The evening progressed with its usual rhythm of formal presentations, speeches, and carefully choreographed social interactions. Charles delivered his remarks about the importance of environmental conservation and community service, receiving polite applause from the assembled crowd. Camilla stood proudly beside him, playing her role as the supportive spouse. But as the formal portion of the evening concluded and the reception began, something shifted in the dynamics of the room. Charles found himself gravitating toward Kate more frequently than protocol would typically suggest. Their conversations seemed more intense, more personal than the usual royal small talk. "You look troubled tonight," Kate observed quietly, as they stood near one of the tall windows overlooking the palace gardens. The lights from the city beyond created a romantic backdrop that neither of them acknowledged directly. Charles turned to study her face, noting the genuine concern in her eyes. "There are matters weighing on my mind," he admitted. "Decisions that need to be made, paths that need to be chosen." Kate nodded, understanding that he was speaking in the coded language that royal life often required. "Sometimes the heart knows what the mind struggles to accept," she replied softly. Their conversation was interrupted by the arrival of William, who joined them with his characteristic easy smile. "I hope I'm not interrupting anything important," he said, though his eyes moved between his father and wife with a sharpness that suggested he was more aware of undercurrents than he let on. "Just discussing the success of tonight's event," Charles replied smoothly, though his gaze lingered on Kate for a moment longer than necessary. As the evening continued, various members of the royal family and their guests moved through the expected social rituals. The Queen Mother's portrait seemed to watch over the proceedings from its place of honor on the wall, a reminder of traditions and expectations that had guided the family for generations. Camilla found herself in conversation with several foreign dignitaries, discussing cultural exchange programs and charitable initiatives. She was in her element, demonstrating the diplomatic skills that had made her an asset to the royal family. Yet she couldn't shake the feeling that something significant was happening just outside her peripheral vision. The palace staff moved efficiently through the crowd, ensuring that glasses remained filled and conversation flowed smoothly. They had worked countless royal events and had learned to read the subtle signs of tension or drama that occasionally surfaced during such gatherings. Tonight, several of the more experienced staff members exchanged glances that suggested they sensed something unusual in the air. As the clock approached 10 o'clock, the traditional time when such events would begin to wind down, Charles made an unexpected announcement. "Ladies and gentlemen," he called out, his voice carrying across the ballroom, "before we conclude this evening, I would like to share something personal with all of you." The room fell silent immediately. Even the background music seemed to pause, as every eye turned toward him. This was not part of the planned program, and the departure from script sent a ripple of anticipation through the crowd. Camilla looked up sharply from her conversation, her diplomatic smile freezing in place as she tried to read Charles's expression from across the room. Kate, who had been standing near the refreshment table with William, felt her heart begin to race without fully understanding why. "Throughout my life, I have been blessed with the support and companionship of remarkable women," Charles continued, his voice steady but carrying an emotional undertone that hadn't been present during his earlier formal remarks. "Tonight, I find myself compelled to acknowledge the truth of my feelings, regardless of the consequences." The silence in the room was now complete. Even the staff had stopped their movement, frozen in place as they realized they were witnessing something unprecedented. The very air seemed to hold its breath. Charles began walking slowly across the ballroom floor, his eyes fixed on a point that the crowd gradually realized was not where Camilla stood, but rather where Kate remained motionless near the far wall. Each step he took seemed to echo despite the thick carpet beneath his feet. William's face underwent a transformation from polite interest to confusion, to something approaching alarm, as he began to understand the direction of his father's movement. His hand instinctively moved toward Kate's arm, but she had already stepped slightly away from him, as if drawn by some invisible force. The guests closest to Charles's path automatically moved aside, creating a clear corridor across the ballroom. The metaphor was lost on no one present. He was quite literally crossing a line, moving from one part of his life to another, with each deliberate step. Camilla remained frozen in her position, her face a mask of royal training that concealed the shock and growing realization of what was happening. Years of public life had taught her to maintain composure under any circumstances, but nothing had prepared her for this moment. As Charles drew closer to Kate, the tension in the room became almost unbearable. Several guests shifted nervously, unsure whether they should look away or continue watching what was clearly becoming a deeply personal moment playing out in the most public of settings. Kate's own training in royal protocol warred with her personal emotions as she watched Charles approach. Her mind raced through the implications of whatever was about to happen, while her heart responded to something she had perhaps been denying for longer than she cared to admit. The distance between them closed until Charles stood directly in front of Kate, the entire ballroom serving as witness to whatever words he might speak next. The moment stretched endlessly, filled with the weight of history, tradition, and the recognition that some lines, once crossed, could never be uncrossed. William took a step forward, then stopped, clearly uncertain about his role in whatever drama was unfolding before his eyes. His loyalty to his father competed with his love for his wife and his duty to the crown, creating a paralysis that reflected the confusion of everyone in the room. The chandeliers continued to sparkle overhead, the flowers continued to fill the air with their sweet fragrance, and the portraits of previous generations of royals continued to gaze down from the walls. But in this moment, the present had taken on a momentum of its own, carrying everyone in the room toward a future that none of them could have predicted when the evening began. Charles raised his hand slowly, and every person in the ballroom understood that whatever happened next would change everything they thought they knew about duty, love, and the price of following one's heart in a world where personal desires had always been secondary to public obligation. The moment Charles's fingers intertwined with Kate's, the silence in the ballroom became deafening. It was as if the very walls of Buckingham Palace held their breath, understanding that they were witnessing a moment that would be remembered and discussed for generations to come. Kate's hand trembled slightly in his grasp, but she didn't pull away. Her eyes met his, and in that instant, years of carefully maintained boundaries seemed to dissolve. The connection between them, which had grown quietly over countless family gatherings, official functions, and private conversations, was suddenly laid bare for everyone to see. "Charles," she whispered, her voice barely audible even to those standing closest to them. The single word carried a lifetime of questions, fears, and possibilities. Across the room, Camilla's face had gone completely pale. The emerald necklace at her throat rose and fell with her rapid breathing as she struggled to process what she was witnessing. Her hands, which had been gracefully holding a crystal champagne flute, began to shake so violently that one of the nearby guests gently took the glass from her before it could shatter on the marble floor. William stood frozen between his father and his wife, his usual diplomatic composure completely abandoned. His mouth opened and closed several times as if he were trying to speak, but no words came. The training he had received his entire life to handle any royal crisis had never prepared him for this particular scenario. The guests in the ballroom began to react in waves. Those closest to the dramatic scene were the first to understand what was happening, their faces reflecting shock, fascination, and in some cases, a terrible understanding that they were witnessing the potential destruction of everything the royal family represented. Lady Henderson, one of Camilla's oldest friends, took a step forward, as if to intervene, but her husband caught her arm and shook his head slightly. This was not a moment for outside interference, regardless of how well-intentioned. "Your Majesty," Kate said softly, using the formal address even as her personal world tilted completely off its axis. "Everyone is watching." Charles tightened his grip on her hand slightly. "Let them watch," he replied, his voice carrying across the silent ballroom with surprising clarity. "I have spent my entire life making decisions based on what others expected of me, what they thought was proper, what they believed was my duty. Tonight, for perhaps the first time, I am choosing to follow my heart." The words hit Camilla like physical blows. She had known Charles for most of her adult life, had waited for him through his marriage to Diana, had supported him through the darkest periods of public criticism, and had eventually found her way to his side as his wife. To hear him speak of following his heart while holding another woman's hand was a betrayal that cut deeper than any public humiliation. An elderly duke near the back of the room began to quietly shepherd his wife toward the exit, understanding that whatever was happening was too private and too potentially damaging for casual observers to witness. Other guests began to follow their lead, creating a subtle but noticeable movement toward the doors. But most remained, drawn by the magnetic pull of witnessing history in the making, however uncomfortable that history might be. Kate's mind raced as she tried to understand the full implications of this moment. She thought of her children, sleeping safely in their beds at home, unaware that their mother's life was changing irrevocably in a ballroom filled with strangers. She thought of William, standing just feet away, and the pain that must be coursing through him as he watched his father declare feelings for his wife. "This isn't right," she said quietly, though she made no move to pull her hand away. "Think of what this means, what it will cost." Charles turned to look at William, his son, his heir, and saw in his eyes a mixture of hurt, confusion, and something that might have been understanding. "I'm sorry," he said, his voice breaking slightly. "I never intended for this to happen. But I cannot continue to pretend that what I feel doesn't exist." William finally found his voice. "Father," he said, the word heavy with years of complicated relationship. "What are you asking of us?" Before Charles could respond, Camilla moved. She walked across the ballroom with the same grace she had demonstrated throughout the evening. But now there was steel in her spine and fire in her eyes. The guests parted before her as if she were Moses approaching the Red Sea. She stopped just outside the intimate circle that Charles and Kate had created, her presence immediately shifting the dynamics of the already charged moment. 40 years, she said, her voice controlled but carrying undertones of devastation. 40 years I have loved you, Charles. Through your marriage to Diana, through the scandals, through the public hatred directed at me for simply existing in your life. 40 years of waiting, hoping, believing that someday we would find our way to each other properly. The ballroom was so quiet that the distant sound of London traffic could be heard through the tall windows. And now, Camilla continued, you choose this moment. In front of all these people. To declare that your heart belongs to someone else? To your son's wife? Kate finally pulled her hand away from Charles's grasp, the spell broken by the raw pain in Camilla's voice. She took a step back, then another, as if distance might somehow undo what had just occurred. I never wanted this, Kate said, her voice stronger now but filled with anguish. I never asked for these feelings, never encouraged them. I have always tried to do what was right, what was proper. But you felt them nonetheless, Charles said, not as an accusation but as a statement of shared truth. Kate closed her eyes briefly, then opened them to look directly at William. Yes, she admitted. God help me. Yes. The admission hung in the air like smoke from a fire that had finally burst into flame after smoldering for years. William's face went through another series of expressions before settling into something resembling resignation. How long? William asked quietly. Kate and Charles exchanged a look that spoke volumes. I don't know exactly when it began, Kate said truthfully. It grew so gradually that I didn't recognize it for what it was, until it was already too late to stop. The charity gala last spring, Charles said suddenly. Do you remember? We were discussing the children's hospital project, and you laughed at something I said. Really laughed, not the polite response that royal life usually requires. In that moment, I saw you not as my daughter-in-law, not as William's wife, but as yourself, as Kate, and I realized that what I felt for you had moved far beyond familial affection. William ran his hands through his hair, a gesture that reminded everyone present that beneath the royal titles and public roles, these were real people, dealing with real emotions and real consequences. What happens now? He asked, looking around at the faces still watching from around the ballroom. How do we move forward from this? The question hung in the air without an easy answer. The implications were staggering. The monarchy had survived many scandals throughout history. But this particular situation seemed to challenge the very foundations of duty, loyalty, and family that the institution was built upon. One of Charles's private secretaries appeared at the edge of the group, his face professionally neutral, despite the chaos he had just witnessed. Your Majesty, he said quietly, perhaps this conversation might be continued in a more private setting? Charles looked around the ballroom as if suddenly remembering where they were. The remaining guests were doing their best to appear as though they weren't listening to every word. But the pretense was thin at best. Yes, he agreed. Yes, you're right. He turned to address the room. Ladies and gentlemen, I apologize for the unusual ending to this evening. Please consider the reception concluded, and thank you for your attendance. The dismissal was polite but firm, and the guests began filing out with remarkable efficiency. Conversations were already beginning in hushed tones as they moved toward the exits. And everyone understood that by morning, the story would have spread far beyond the walls of the palace. As the ballroom emptied, only the four of them remained, along with a handful of staff members who were desperately trying to appear invisible while they began the process of cleaning up. The crystal chandeliers continued to cast their golden light over the scene, but the magic of the evening had been replaced by the harsh reality of consequences and difficult choices. Camilla was the first to break the silence. I won't make this easy for you, she said, looking directly at Charles. I won't simply step aside gracefully and allow you to pursue this fantasy. Too much has been sacrificed, too much has been endured. I understand, Charles replied. I wouldn't expect you to. Kate found herself caught between worlds, the world she had known as William's wife and a potential future she had never allowed herself to fully imagine. The weight of the choice ahead of her was overwhelming. But the moment of truth had arrived, and there was no going back to the careful pretenses that had protected all of them until now. The ballroom that had witnessed so many celebrations, so many moments of royal pageantry, had now become the stage for a drama that would test the strength of love, duty, and the price of following one's heart regardless of the consequences. The days following the ballroom revelation passed in a blur of emergency meetings, hastily arranged private conversations, and an unprecedented level of palace damage control. The story had broken in the press within hours, despite the best efforts of the royal communications team. Headlines screamed across front pages around the world, each more sensational than the last. Kate found herself essentially under house arrest, not by any official order, but by the simple reality that stepping outside meant facing a wall of photographers and reporters who had been camping outside her residence since dawn the morning after the ball. She spent long hours staring out her bedroom window, watching the circus below while trying to make sense of the earthquake that had shaken her life apart. William had left the house on the second day, ostensibly to fulfill some royal duties that couldn't be postponed. But Kate knew he needed space to think. Their conversations since that night had been careful, polite, and devastatingly formal. He hadn't shouted, hadn't accused, hadn't demanded explanations. Somehow, his quiet dignity made everything worse. On the fourth morning, Kate woke to find Charles sitting in her garden. He had somehow managed to arrive without alerting the media swarm, probably through one of the palace's many unofficial channels. She dressed quickly and made her way outside, knowing that this conversation could no longer be delayed. "I've been thinking," Charles said without preamble as she approached the bench where he sat, "about what you said that night. About costs and consequences." Kate sat beside him, careful to maintain some distance, even though they were hidden from the cameras by tall hedges. "And what have you concluded?" "That you were right," he said simply. "The cost is too high. Not just for us, but for everyone we care about. William doesn't deserve this. Your children don't deserve this. Even Camilla, despite everything, doesn't deserve this." Kate felt a strange mixture of relief and disappointment. "So, you're ending it before it truly began?" Charles was quiet for a long moment, watching a robin that had landed nearby. "I'm saying that love isn't always about getting what you want. Sometimes it's about choosing what's right, even when what's right breaks your heart." "The noble sacrifice," Kate said, though not unkindly. "Maybe. Or maybe just the recognition that some lines shouldn't be crossed, no matter how much we want to cross them." He turned to look at her. "But I won't pretend that what I feel for you isn't real. I won't diminish that by calling it a mistake or a moment of madness." Kate nodded, understanding. "Neither will I." They sat in comfortable silence for several minutes, both aware that this might be the last time they could share such a moment of honest intimacy. "What will you tell the press?" Kate asked finally. Charles smiled ruefully. "The truth, in a way. That emotions ran high at a celebratory event. That words were spoken in the heat of the moment that were misinterpreted, and that there has never been any question about my commitment to my marriage, or your commitment to yours. Will they believe it? Some will. Others will continue to speculate. But time has a way of moving on to new scandals, new stories. This too will eventually fade." Kate wasn't sure she believed that, but she appreciated the hope in his words. Later that afternoon, Camilla arrived unexpectedly. Kate found her in the same garden where Charles had sat that morning, and for a moment, she wondered if this was some kind of cosmic test. "I came to speak with you," Camilla said without any preliminary greeting. Her usual polish was intact, but Kate could see the strain around her eyes. "I'm listening," Kate replied, taking the same seat Charles had occupied hours earlier. "I want you to know that I don't blame you," Camilla said, her words careful but sincere. "What happened between you and Charles? These things sometimes develop without anyone intending them to. I know that better than most." Kate was surprised by the generosity of the statement. "Thank you for saying that. But I also want you to understand what you would be destroying if you choose to pursue this path." Camilla's voice hardened slightly. "Not just my marriage, though that matters to me. You would be destroying the monarchy itself, the institution that Charles has spent his entire life preparing to lead." "I know," Kate said quietly. "Do you? Really?" Camilla leaned forward. "The public has only recently begun to accept me as Charles's wife. It took decades of careful rehabilitation, of proving my worth, of earning forgiveness for sins both real and imagined. If Charles were to leave me for you, for his son's wife, the damage would be irreversible. The monarchy would not survive it." Kate felt the weight of history and duty pressing down on her shoulders. "What are you asking of me?" "I'm asking you to choose the greater good over personal happiness. I'm asking you to remember that some things are larger than our individual desires. Camilla paused. "I'm asking you to save us all from ourselves." That evening, Kate called a family meeting. William returned home, looking older than he had a week earlier. They sat in their private sitting room, the children safely asleep upstairs, and faced the conversation that would determine the rest of their lives. "I've made a decision," Kate began, her voice steady despite the trembling in her hands. "I'm going away for a while." William looked up sharply. "Going away where?" "My aunt has a cottage in Scotland. Very remote, very private. I need time to think, time to figure out how to move forward." "Are you leaving me?" William asked directly. Kate met his eyes. "I don't know," she said honestly. "I need to understand what I want, what I can live with, what's fair to you and to the children." William nodded slowly. "And Charles?" "Charles has made his choice. He's staying with Camilla. He's choosing duty over desire. But you haven't made that same choice." Kate was quiet for a long moment. "I'm trying to, but I need time to make sure it's real, to make sure it will hold." 3 weeks later, Kate was walking along a lonely Scottish beach, the wind whipping her hair across her face as she contemplated the gray waters of the North Sea. She had found a kind of peace in the isolation, a clarity that had been impossible amid the chaos of London. Her phone rang rarely here. But when it did, she answered. Today, it was William. "How are you?" he asked, and she could hear genuine concern in his voice. "Better," she replied honestly. "Clearer. Have you decided what you want to do?" Kate watched the waves crash against the rocky shore, thinking about choices and consequences, about love and duty, about the difference between what we want and what we can live with. "I want to come home," she said finally. "I want to try to rebuild what we had, if you'll have me." The silence on the other end of the line stretched long enough that Kate began to worry the call had been dropped. "Will it be enough?" William asked finally. "What we had, what we can rebuild, will it be enough for you?" Well, it was the question Kate had been asking herself every day for 3 weeks. "I think it has to be," she said. "Not because it's what's expected, but because it's what's right. Because what Charles and I felt for each other, however real it was built on a foundation that would have destroyed everything we both care about. And if you see him again, if those feelings return," Kate had considered this too. "They may never fully go away," she admitted. "But feelings and actions are different things. I can choose to act on love for you, for our family, for the life we've built together. Even if other feelings exist alongside those choices." When Kate returned to London a week later, she found a world that had begun to move on. The press had indeed found new scandals to pursue, though the whispers and speculation continued in certain circles. Charles and Camilla appeared together at several public events, presenting a united front that gradually began to restore confidence in their marriage. The first time Kate saw Charles again was at a family christening 6 months later. They exchanged polite greetings, careful not to let their hands touch, careful not to let their eyes linger too long on each other's faces. But they both smiled genuine smiles, the smiles of people who had found a way to care about each other without destroying everything else in the process. William noticed the interaction, and later that evening, as they prepared for bed, he spoke about it. "I saw you with him today," he said without accusation. "And what did you see?" Kate asked. "I saw two people who care about each other but who have chosen something bigger than their own desires." William paused in brushing his teeth. "I saw my wife choosing our family." Kate moved to stand behind him, meeting his eyes in the bathroom mirror. "Always," she said simply. The years that followed were not without their challenges. There were moments when Kate caught Charles looking at her across a crowded room with an expression that reminded her of what they had shared. There were times when she wondered what might have been if they had chosen differently. But there were also moments of deep satisfaction in the choice she had made. Watching her children grow, seeing William develop into the leader he was meant to become, finding ways to use her position to make meaningful differences in the world. These things provided a fulfillment that was different from passionate love, but no less real. On the 10th anniversary of the ballroom incident, Kate received an unexpected letter. Charles had written to thank her for the choice she had made, for saving him from himself and from a decision that would have destroyed not just their family but the institution they all served. "You showed me," he wrote, "that sometimes the greatest act of love is letting go. You saved us all, and I will be forever grateful." Kate read the letter twice, then carefully filed it away. Some chapters in life were meant to be closed, but that didn't mean they should be forgotten. What she and Charles had shared was real, and it had changed them both. But it had also taught them something valuable about the difference between love and wisdom, between desire and duty. As she looked out the window of her office at the London skyline, Kate reflected on the strange turns life could take. She had found love in an impossible place with an impossible person, and in choosing to walk away from it, she had discovered something else entirely. The deep satisfaction that comes from making choices that honor not just personal feelings, but the larger responsibilities we bear to others. The ballroom at Buckingham Palace continued to host celebrations and ceremonies, its crystal chandeliers casting the same golden light over new generations of royal events. But for Kate, it would always be the place where she learned that sometimes the most powerful moment in life comes not from reaching for what you want, but from having the strength to choose what's right.